Inside of Visual Studio, I have some markup in place that renders the page we're looking at here on the right-hand side of the screen. There's a fair amount of content in here because I want to use this content to manipulate the layout and positioning of elements. The only styles that are currently applied are styles that will set the margin around these three buttons that we see, and a style that will set the width of each of those buttons to be exactly 120 pixels. Since inputs are inline elements, we can see those three buttons stacking up against each other and moving out horizontally. Their position is static, so they're following the normal flow of the document, and let's change that up a bit. I want to change this actually just for the last button. So I'm going to say buttons, input, last child. And what we'll do to the last child inside that series of buttons, button number 3, is we'll set, first of all, let's set the position to be relative. And if that's all I do, it doesn't make any changes on the page. But now that I've set it relative, what I can start doing is start manipulating the top and left properties, or the bottom and right properties. So I can say top 20 pixels, left 50 pixels. And if you watch this button, what it's going to do is move down an additional 20 pixels and left an additional 50 pixels from where it should have been. So it's moving relative to where it should have been in the normal flow of the document. You can also specify bottom and right. So if I do that, we move over from the right by 50 pixels and up from the bottom by 20 pixels. But now if I change this back to the way it was, I also want to point out that you can use negative units here. So I can say move up 20 pixels and left 50 pixels, same effect. And in fact, if I move to the left, about 185 pixels, then I can position this button almost in the middle between button 1 and button 2. Now you might be looking at this and saying, isn't this sort of similar to margin and padding? Aren't you moving things around by pixels, and can't you do the same thing with margin and padding? And the answer is yes. In many cases, if all you want to do is move something to the left just a few pixels, you could do that with a margin, you could do that with a padding. The difference with relative positioning is that you can actually have something like button 3 sitting directly on top of button 2 and completely ignoring padding and margin and things like that. So if we remove top and refresh, now button 3 is literally overlapping button 1 and button 2. And let's try something else different. Let's try putting top back in, but making this 220 pixels, and now you can see that button 3 is floating over a paragraph that's lower in the page. So you have to be careful with positioning, and make sure that you have enough space around your elements if you start moving them around so that they're not overlapping, unless that is the effect that you're trying to achieve. This positioning can be applied to any element. So let's remove the manipulation that we're doing with buttons, put those back in place, and let's go into the page and find this paragraph that is here below the box model heading, and I'm going to give it a class just so I can identify it. Let's just call the class temp. And inside of styles.css, I could say temp, position relative, move down from the top 50 pixels, move in from the left 20 pixels, and now when I refresh, this paragraph should jump, and you can see it's actually overlapping the image that appears below. I could also move it in the opposite direction. And again, you can see that you have to be careful that you have the space to be able to move an element. Unlike applying padding or margin, when the paragraph moves, it's not going to try to push anything out of its way. It's literally just going to jump and sit on top of the other thing.